South China Morning Post, 12th of May 2023, before the G7, Lithuania's foreign minister urged a coordinated international response to China's economic pressure. For Lithuanian Foreign Minister Gabrielius Landsbergis, who has defended his nation against China's full strength, Chinese economic pressure is not a theoretical concept. He believes that Beijing's pressure efforts will probably continue, and they demand a well-coordinated international counter-strategy. Next week's gathering of the Group of 7 economies in Japan aims to create such a reaction. However, this is easier said than done, given how wealthy countries balance divergent economic interests while Beijing moves swiftly and can speak with a single voice. It became essential whether we were able to sustain, were able to defend, a country like Lithuania, which is quite little, said Landsbergis. He said, "We will find a consensus. It'll take some time. And as usual, it will be somewhere in the middle." G7 members eager to mobilize a response can cite several recent instances of China's targeted sanctions against Lithuania in 2021 for approving a Taiwan representative office rather than using the Taipei name, against Australia in 2020 after its call to investigate the origins of the coronavirus, against South Korea in 2017 after it decides to house a U.S. anti-missile system, and against Japan in 2010 over a territorial dispute. The descriptions are incorrect, according to China. According to a commentary by the Communist Party mouthpiece People's Daily last year, the U.S. purposefully misrepresented China's lawful efforts to preserve national sovereignty as economic coercion. China does not practice long-arm jurisdiction. The U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, strongly supports a forceful G7 response in Hiroshima. The former White House chief of staff for Barack Obama, known as Rambo for his no-holds-barred approach, sees the problem as a mission. On this, China can be defeated. However, to counter China's coercion, you must use a variety of economic measures. During a panel discussion for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, a Washington-based think group, Emanuel stated this: "Lithuania would have been in a different place if they weren't a part of the EU. China can't ultimately dismantle a broad coalition." Principled agreement on the need to counter China's more aggressive posturing is typically found among the G7 economies. The suggestions include forming a task force with like-minded nations, exchanging best practices, methods, and resources, offering assistance to the targeted countries, and deterring future attacks by diversifying supply chains. But how to effectively counter Beijing's divide-and-conquer strategies and decide whether to respond or keep the moral high ground are more challenging. Analysts predicted that the G7 leaders would mention the need to combat coercion in their upcoming communiqué without mentioning China. China scarcely has a monopoly on economic coercion, as at least ancient Rome used financial means to achieve political ends. The U.S. exerts pressure on China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea by manipulating the value of the U.S. dollar. And it has pushed for semiconductor manufacturing to be located in the U.S. by relying on Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. According to Adam Boesen, president of the Peterson Institute of International Economics, PIIE, that's something we used to accuse the Chinese of doing. There is no reason why China and the U.S. couldn't commit the same error simultaneously. According to observers, one distinction is that Beijing has tried to operate outside public scrutiny, while Washington has traditionally used legal processes involving judicial review. According to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, between 2020 and 2022, China engaged in 73 instances of economic coercion against 19 different nations. The most popular target was Europe, followed by Australia, New Zealand, and East Asia, with Taiwan being the most commonly used core interest to justify coercive actions. Given rising nationalism and sensitivity over perceived threats to Communist Party interests, Beijing is expected to further up its use of coercion, and expand its use against larger governments. Assuming geopolitical tensions between the United States and China continue apace, a risk-averse Beijing will likely continue to prefer economic tools to more escalatory military ones in its effort to coerce other states, a Xi's research on coercion stated in March. Studies indicate that while Chinese pressure techniques frequently harm international businesses and industries, their overall economic impact is modest. Despite Beijing's 2017 sanctions against South Korea's tourism, retail, and entertainment industries, bilateral commerce increased by 14%. The political victories Beijing has had are likewise uneven. Following a visit by the Dalai Lama in 2016, Mongolia yielded to Chinese demands before electing a more rigid administration. Under Chinese pressure, the Philippines initially downplayed its claim to Scarborough Shoal, which Beijing also claims and refers to as Huangyan Island, but later consented to host 4 additional U.S. outposts. According to Matthew Goodman, Senior Vice President for Economics at Xi's, China's economic coercion is frequently ineffective or counterproductive, he told Congress last month. Goodman, a co-author of the Xi's study from March and a former official at the Obama administration's National Security Council, continued, "In most of the cases we studied, Beijing struggled to achieve its near-term tactical goals and frequently caused harm to its strategic interests, including by driving other countries toward the United States." The proposed European anti-coercion machinery, Japan's China exit subsidies for vulnerable companies, South Korea's new Southern policy, and language in the upcoming 2023 U.S. National Defense Authorization Act to establish a National Security Council-led economic coercion task force are just a few of the numerous national and regional initiatives that the G7 organizers hope to integrate. Given its historical structure of vassal states, observers claim that China's playbook, developed over decades, if not centuries, has tended to target smaller nations with more significant clout. No affected nation has had a GDP more significant than 15% of China's before its 2010 Japan campaign. Lithuania's GDP is less than 1%. Additionally, China likes to use state-owned companies, the media, the public, or regulations in its efforts because it gives it plausible deniability, enables it to move fast, avoid WTO complaints, and lessens the diplomatic impact. In 2017, state media blamed strong feelings in the general public and fire safety violations for the rapid drop in sales that led to the closure of South Korean retail stores in China. Complete economic decoupling between nations is neither desirable nor feasible. As a result, China will always have some levers at its disposal, according to the Xi's report. Any built economic defenses will be examined by China for vulnerabilities. However, unofficial tools also imply that interest groups can get around them, as was the case when Chinese institutions continued to buy Lithuanian lasers throughout the confrontation between China and Lithuania. Additionally, not every perceived slight results in a Chinese reaction, indicating that imagined benefits must be carefully weighed against unavoidable financial or reputational consequences. The Chinese state-backed tabloid Global Times hinted at this in 2017 when it stated that harsh measures against Seoul were appropriate given that damage to Korea is disproportionately larger than damage to China. Fearing fallout, Beijing has typically chosen words over deeds in the U.S., as was recently the case after Washington placed export limits on expensive semiconductors. When Nancy Pelosi, the then House Speaker, visited Taiwan in August, Beijing primarily targeted Taipei. Occasionally, China targets a less powerful U.S. partner. However, China's initiatives might be expensive. When access to its sizable market is denied, it is forced to establish alternate supply routes, as when it stopped receiving Australian iron ore, which was crucial for its sizable real estate and infrastructure sectors. Economic pressure can also undermine confidence, strengthen resistance, and harm exports. Tokyo reduced its China origin share from 85% in 2009 to 58% by 2020 due to China punishing Japan by stopping supplies of rare earth minerals. Unfavorable perceptions of China increased last year, according to a Pew Research study, with record highs in the US, Canada, Germany, and South Korea. These perceptions were linked to human rights, military might, economic competition, and perceived involvement. Xi's associate Jude Blanchette states, "The more China uses economic coercion, and the more we highlight it, the more it creates antibodies that blunt the effectiveness. Team G7 is better than Team PRC, in my opinion." However, economic pressure may have less tangible advantages and promote self-censorship among businesses and countries under pressure to adopt Chinese national security and human rights policies. For instance, when Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, 19 nations abstained. Beijing could not even consider international opinion its single or crucial factor. Standing up to hostile Western nations that aim to keep China down is popular at home and strengthens ties between the Chinese people and the ruling Communist Party. Beijing may view the diplomatic costs as bearable to the extent that it also strengthens the regime's domestic legitimacy, Xi stated in its analysis. With an electorate willing to endure temporary economic disruption and unemployment over the naming dispute, Lithuania, a Baltic nation of 2.8 million people, sees the value in taking a moral stance. Beijing has worked for years to prevent the official recognition of Taiwan, which it sees as a province gone rogue. The Taiwan office in Vilnius received a swift and fierce response from Beijing. Landsbergis said at a recent PIE event that it ceased commerce with Lithuania, which disappeared from Chinese customs records as evidenced by a 91% decrease in imports in December 2021 over the previous year. China attributed Vilnius complaints to a computer error, and the Global Times dismissed Lithuania's claims of economic coercion as imaginary when Vilnius complained. Landsbergis and his colleagues launched a case with the WTO. After realizing Lithuania was vastly outmatched, they alerted Washington, Brussels, and the G7, highlighting its long history as a victim of powerful nations. Furthermore, Lithuania was able to locate new customers rather rapidly because its main exports to China are raw materials. He said, "We had a tale to tell." Beijing backed down in response to mounting American and European Union resistance and criticism for bullying. Since then, almost all of Lithuania's imports and exports have resumed, despite Vilnius's aspirations to diversify its China trade more permanently and take other measures to oppose Russian and Chinese dictatorship. Landsbergis stated, "I'm just looking to the future. This is political. This is how it takes place. In the next 10 years, China will be cut off from the rest of the globe.